Complex essences, as we have seen, are not compounded. This is one of the most fruitful reflections which speculation about essence can suggest. It can cure us of the most stubborn prejudices in physics. It can show us the vanity of any psychologism, mental chemistry, or attempt to generate ideas out of ideas, and it can help us to place the realm of essence where it belongs at an infinite remove from the accidents of any evolving world or any intellectual or moral scale. In the material sphere, it is common for complex things such as plants to be formed out of others, such as seeds, earth, sunshine, and water, which to human apprehension are more simple. The arts visibly continue this process of construction. An architect, for instance, deliberately causes various materials to be collected and built into his edifice, and the finished building is evidently an assemblage of substances and patterns, each of which was known first in isolation and now contributes mechanically or aesthetically to a result which, since the architect half intended, half desired, and half directed it, seems to him an achievement. At the same time, the very certainty that he has selected these elements and combined them, and that they undoubtedly conspire more or less obviously to produce the result, may cause him some disappointment and, if he is metaphysically inclined, some perplexity. For many of those elements, aesthetically considered, have disappeared or have changed their character, and even the total effect or actual uses of the structure in carrying out approximately his material specifications are unprecedented and fall together otherwise than he expected. Indeed, the poverty of the result, artistic and moral, may be out of all proportion to the richness of detail and the careful intentions which occupied him in making the plans. The angels that watched his labor will not revisit the finished work. The essence of the whole is not compounded of the essences of the parts, but in a new essence, a summary unity, perhaps simpler, and at any rate original. A thorough appreciation of this point would save philosophers from many a false assumption and insoluble problem. Things are never compounded of their qualities, but of their substances. If the composite thing retains vestiges of the original qualities of the parts, this is due to an imperfect fusion of the materials, such that each part remains a separate fact, still separately observable. This happens in discursive painting or description of mere aggregates, never in living intuition or in theoretic insight. Again, even when the compound is single and new, the effect of it on some organ blunt to this new order of essences may be very like the effect of one or other of the original objects, as when we complain how monotonous and equivalent things or persons are in this world, in spite of their newness. It follows that any degree of composition in a thing may go with a perfect simplicity in its total essence, be this essence formal or specious. Nor can this resulting essence have been native to any of the components. It has been embodied or has appeared, as the case may be, by a formal necessity or by a natural mutation upon the juxtaposition of those elements. So a spark may result from the friction of two bodies, who knows how complex. A pure pain may result from an elaborate disorder. A rounded blue sky may result from a flat sea of refracting atoms caught in an earthly eye. The living transcript of facts into sensations without ceasing to be a mystery, as all existence must be, thus ceases to seem an anomaly. For if anything new was ever to arise or to be revealed to sense, it had to assume an essence not the essence of its compound conditions. And it simply remains for observation to specify, when it can, what their normal transformations are for the time being in our parts of the universe. There is a stock objection to materialism that looks very foolish when seen in the light of these essential necessities. Matter, it is said, cannot explain the origin of life, of consciousness, or of morals. Matter here means the essence which some philosopher attributes or is alleged to attribute to matter. This essence has probably suggested itself to the philosopher's imagination after much consideration of the ways of nature. It is a simple, perhaps a merely mathematical term. Now, no essence can be the origin of anything, not even of another essence, much less of any fact. But the forms which nature wears could not be successive, or be embodied anywhere, if matter did not assume, connect, and exchange them. Of course, this real matter, coming down through the ages and falling into these forms, is not anybody's idea of matter. Its intrinsic essence is unknown, and if we prefer for that reason to call it by another name, we are at liberty to do so, provided we honestly attribute to it, under that sweeter name, all the relations and functions by which the existence of matter has become certain to common sense, and has been assumed by science and the arts since the beginning of history. The essence which any man attributes to matter expresses his own experience much better than it does the nature of matter itself, but it will be a true idea, as a sensation or maxim may be true, if it exactly reports some circumstance or relation or specious quality which it interests us to discover in that province of nature. The point that interests us in practical science and art is the method of genius in things, which determines the successive embodiment. The point that interests us in practical science and art is the method of genesis in things, which determines the successive embodiment of essences in them, their quantity and distribution. The essences distinguish the occasions, but the movement of matter produces them in their places, and makes those essences relevant to existence at all. The incapacity of the materialist to deduce logically from the terms of his theory, such as extension, atoms, electric charges, energy, or whatnot, the other variegated terms in which our senses or imagination may picture the world, is therefore a matter of course. Far from being a defect, this is a sign that his theory is not merely verbal, but may have penetrated beneath the confused surface of events and partly traced their dynamic thread, whereas a pictorial physics that should literally reproduce everything just as it appears would be entirely unintelligent and perfectly useless. There is a more speculative prejudice which should also vanish before the equal primacy of all essences. It is the feeling that complexity, beyond a certain point, is something difficult, unlikely, and incredible. This feeling is human, too human. It expresses our skepticism or amusement or despair before any object that stretches too much our powers of intuition. It is relative to the human scale and has no meaning in the field of being as a whole. The measure of complexity or of unity that best suits the human mind is itself variable, but wherever it may be fixed, it will mark one degree in an infinite series of proportions, each neither more nor less central or proper than any other degree. Even nature seems to be full of a vastness and a minuteness that baffle us, yet are her homeliest accidents, and disproportionate as her scale may be to our fancy, she after all contains us and this fancy of ours, and at bottom she may be composed in a fashion relatively sympathetic to our categories of thought. For instance, atomically, monotonously, or subject to calculation, so that to speak of composition, elaboration, and a precarious, evolved complexity may not be meaningless in respect to natural things. Even size, childish as the notion seems, might have a natural measure. For instance, If the more atoms a thing contained, the larger it should be said to be, or if the organizing forces emanating from one nucleus had a greater scope than those emanating from another, so that the smaller organism might be enveloped in the larger and be a part of it. If a thing is infinite, either inwards or outwards, forward or back, a scale may be fixed by which it may be internally measured. But in the realm of essence, all such foothold fails for human prerogative. Here, every degree of complexity is as calmly enthroned as every other. None is more primitive or natural or safe than the rest, since all are necessary and all eternal. The most agitated Paradiso ever painted by Tintoretto, the most insane Walpurgis Nostrum, is as elementary and fundamental an essence as the number one or the straight line. The realm of essence never was formed. There are no seeds or accretions in it, and we may as legitimately imagine the simple, the monotonous, or the chaotic to be derogations from some organic form, as this organic form to be a composition out of those elements. Existence, that everlasting Penelope, may sometimes embroider and sometimes undo, but all the mornings and all the evenings are one eternity, in which the finished work and the ultimate elements are equally present. Nor is this parity of all essences confined to those which may figure in the evolution of a single world, from its atoms to the idea of its total system, seen under the form of eternity. The parity extends to the unused essences as well. Existence, infinite as it may be in some directions and by a perpetual budding, is narrowly hedged, and at every step it is all bias and exclusions. Not so the depths of pure being. There all is simultaneous, nothing forbidden, nothing preeminent. The homelessness or even terror which sometimes assaults the mind at the thought of so many stars and planets, so many animals and cross purposes even on earth, is redoubled when we consider the truly remorseless infinity of essence. It contains with perfect placidity, and without begging leave either of God or man, everything whatsoever. The selections which nature may make out of that manifold store, whether she picks a simple thing out first or a complex thing first, and who shall say which she picks out first, if she has been picking them out alternately forever, establish no essential priority among them. It is as easy for being to be great as to be little. No effort is concerned, no probability. All great things and all little things are equally integral to the infinite. It follows that all psychologisms, all attempts to analyze given essences into original elements or to assign to them a history or a meaning, are so many materialisms in disguise. Those elements are not elements of the given essence, but are other whole essences which might have been given when the material situation was different. Such history is not the history of these ideas, which have no history, but of the natural course of events which led up to the moment which begat these ideas. A course of events which at various points may have begotten other ideas, introducing those now alive, and having, for the best of reasons, a family likeness to them. Finally, those meanings are not proper to those essences which are what they are and have no further meaning, but express the residual pregnancy of the mind, tempted to wander dramatically and to trace the material agencies, past or future, which may have flowed into or may flow out of the present event, in which now, like bursting rockets, these essences shine forth. Such past and future events will bear names, and will be indicated by imaginary terms which are themselves essences. But the whole force of the felt derivation will come, not from these terms or names, but from an impulse sweeping through them, rehearsed in discourse and covering the unspecified flux of material forces actually carrying events forward from phase to phase. If the reader will recall the method of Hegel or that of Taine, he will understand what I mean. A set of brilliant dramatic sketches or notes of moral attitudes strung together so as to suggest a voluminous current of evolution carrying these various spiritual moments on the crest of its waves. It is a material movement sketched by romantic suggestion and wrapped in moralistic eloquence or even in prophecy. The only veritable idealism is Platonic. It sees in the essences themselves, self-enclosed and insulated, ultimate and eternal. The occasions on which they are manifested may be traced according to the physics or theology in vogue. That temporal underpinning cannot change their intrinsic nature, and as the means of purifying and coming truly to possess an essence is simply to contemplate it, so the means of conceiving the essences given elsewhere, for instance in the feelings and thoughts of other men, is poetic imagination, dramatic sympathy. Shakespeare is your only psychologist. The others are physiologists or external observers who entangle their poetic science in the net of scholastic fictions, the mechanism of life being very obscure and remote from gross observation. It is inevitable that it should be adumbrated at first in fables and metaphors. When the notion of matter is crude and pictorial, there is need of piecing it out with crude and pictorial notions of souls, psychic mechanisms, laws of association, moral dialectic, and blasts of supernatural influence. These are only other names for veritable matter and its secret work, but they point to facts which science may overlook, if it has grown up in the practice of mechanical arts. Maturity in the rhetorical school of physics will render these myths more and more harmless and transparent, as it will all other forms of rhetoric, while maturity in the scientific school, if it is ever attained, will reduce those pictorial models more frankly to symbols, and the field of science to the field of action. But it is not the reform of science that interests me here. I am concerned to rescue from oblivion one of those primary facts which the science of things external ignores, although it is the breath of its nostrils, I mean intuition, with the inevitable unity and originality of the essence which that intuition defines from moment to moment. There is no reason to suppose that nature began by being simpler than she is. We may rather suppose that she has cycles, perhaps local cycles of relative complication with intervals of dissolution or chaos, and the beginnings of intuition can be reasonably looked for only at the height or near the height of this complication. Intuition presupposes reactive adjustment, psychic inertia or propulsion, and therefore an elaborate hereditary life such as only a most delicately balanced cosmos could contain. Yet though begotten and nurtured in the lap of complexity, intuition opens its childish eyes upon blank light. Experience does begin with the simple, although nature does not. The intuition of a simple essence is called a feeling, and the essence given in a primitive feeling is likely to be some truly simple, quite stupid essence, such as sheer intensity. This intensity, when there is some concomitant motion excited in the animal, may seem vaguely to have a seat and to lie in some quarter, and it may be colored with an incipient tint of uneasiness or of contentment. Above all, this intensity will be felt to wax and wane. It comes as a waxing, an interruption to repose, and the interruption over or gulped down, repose comes slowly back. So at least I conceive it. Nature may have many different ways of calling forth intuition, here stealthily, there perhaps suddenly with the flare of trumpets, and with a consciousness of having always existed and of being omniscient. Suffice it that this first revelation, whether to worm or God, is a specious thing, having a specious unity and a precise specious character. The vagueness or abstractness imputed to it when compared with the supposed material circumstances are its very definition and familiar aspect taken in itself. It may be a whiff of emotion, it may be a perception, it may be a moral sentiment redolent of 1,000 high thoughts and profound tragedies. In each case, it will be a complete apparition, born at that moment and dying with it. The onlooker, if informed of its existence, may understand its origin, its truth or falsity, its promise for the future. These are relations external to it, physical or historical. They can be disclosed only when all the postulates of physics, which are those of action, have been made by the discursive intellect in the service of animal faith. In itself, the given essence signifies only that which it is. Its inner perspectives, if any, are of its essence. Such reports or imaginations of things beyond as may trouble it are elements of its being. It is the deliverance of a dream. The remote exists in it only as a part of the immediate. There is no complexity and no length of evolution which the immediate may not synthesize in one picture and possess in its essence. If experience in the child begins with the simple, in the wise man it begins with the complex, and his wisdom need not trouble to banish that complexity and revert to the simple, if it can learn to envisage the complex as a pure essence in its harmless immediacy. Whether his spirit rests on a simple or a complex essence will make no difference to the purity of his contemplation, but will turn on his mood or the accidents of his life and education, things irrelevant to spiritual insight. When I say that in a given essence all its parts are given, is not this an enormous exaggeration? It would be if I meant the material or natural parts of an existing object. These would not only be impossible to assemble into any human view, but would be impossible to define or distinguish individually. For the structure of things is fluid, their composition perhaps infinite inwards, and the relations outwards certainly inexhaustible. But I am speaking of the features actually composing a given essence, and these by definition are all there. They are not and can never be anywhere else, for they are merely the features found as they are found, and where they are found, possessing the precise degree of definition, separation, and connection which they have in that living moment. As to be a living act of spirit is the nature of intuition, so to be an individual unity is the nature of essence. Let me give 3 familiar illustrations of this, one drawn from emotion, one from perception, and one from imagination. Suppose that in a Spanish town I come upon an apparently blind old beggar sitting against a wall, thrumming his feeble guitar, and uttering an occasional hoarse wail by way of singing. It is a sight which I have passed 100 times unnoticed, but now suddenly I am arrested and seized with a voluminous, unreasoning sentiment, call it pity for want of a better name. An analytic psychologist, I myself perhaps in that capacity, might regard my absurd feeling as a compound of the sordid aspect of this beggar and of some obscure bodily sensation in myself, due to lassitude or bile, to a disturbing letter received in the morning, or to the general habit of expecting too little and remembering too much. Or if the psychologist was Freudian, he might invoke some suppressed impression received at the most important period of my life, before the age of 2. But since that supposed impression is forgotten, and those alleged causes are hypothetical, they are no part of what I feel now. What I feel is simply, as Othello says, the pity of it. And if I stop to decipher what this it contains, I may no doubt be led, beyond my first feeling, to various images and romantic perspectives. My fancy might soon be ranging over my whole universe of discourse, over antiquity, over recent wars, over so many things ending in smoke, and my discursive imagery would terminate in dreary cold facts, the prose of history, from which my emotion would have wholly faded. The pity is not for them. It is not for the old man, perhaps a fraud and a dirty miser. It is pity simply, the pity of existence, suffusing, arresting, rendering visionary the spectacle of the moment and spreading blindly outwards, like a light in the dark, towards objects which it does not avail to render distinguishable. There is, then, in this emotion no composition. There is pregnancy, a quality having affinity with certain ulterior things rather than with others, but these things are not given. They are not needed in the emotion, which arises absolutely in its full quality and in its strong simplicity. My life might have begun and ended there. Nothing is too complex to be primitive. Nothing is too simple to stand alone. Suppose now that I turn through the town gates and suddenly see a broad valley spread out before me with the purple sierra in the distance beyond. This expanse, this vastness, fills my intuition. Also, perhaps, some sense of the deeper breath which I draw as if my breast expanded in sympathy with the rounded heavens. Here the psychologist intervening may demur and say that I cannot see depth because depth is a straight line terminating in the eye, along which it is impossible for the eye to travel. Distance, he will assert, must be conveyed to me through a muscular sense and the suggestion of motion, and my perception of the landscape must be compounded of a flat picture in the retina plus sensations in the muscles of the eye, or, as I was innocently confessing, elsewhere in the body, conveying to me the suggestion of a great opportunity to move. It is very true that pictorial space, or the specious essence of extension, appears in intuition to animals capable of locomotion, whose attention has a forward direction, that of action, so that they are capable of feeling the difference between right and left, up and down, forward and back, here and there. All the internal and external organs of their bodies are engaged in these movements, and it is fair to suppose that they all contribute something to the picture of space which, in living, dominates their spirits. But this picture is not in itself laid out in 3 dimensions. These are first discriminated by the geometry of builders in their material blocks and stones, and are specified in their working drawings and calculations. To attempt to piece together pictorial space out of imaginary earlier intuitions of dismembered geometrical elements would be the height of artifice. The third dimension does not need to be added to the other two, because the other two never appear without it. Breathing, stifling, writhing, and running are not felt or seen to occur in flatland before they are felt and seen to occur in space. Perhaps since the possibilities of pure intuition are infinite, some paralytic geometer might see a plane in 2 dimensions at no distance and in no direction from himself, the pure essence of flatness lying nowhere, or lying just there, in its own flat world, and nothing militates against the possibility of conceiving a mathematical plane, if circumstances lead some rapt spirit to lose itself in that essence. But such an essence would be no part of the specious essence of extension as given to ordinary mortals. It would not even be, in any literal sense, an abstraction from the latter, but an essence of a different kind, as algebraic essences are different from geometrical or writing from speech. And nevertheless it might serve to describe in part the same material objects. The plane actually imagined is a feature in pictorial space, not an antecedent to it. The plane is viewed from a point outside and in front of it. Its length and breadth are relative to the distance at which it lies. Animals surely begin by seeing moving objects in a particular quarter beyond themselves, away from the occupied center of their own bodies, else seeing would not be looking, as it is in the play of action. Even if we suppose that Originally, the intuition of extension was not a perception, but only a diffuse feeling without indicative force. This felt extension would be spread in all directions, spherical and roomy, and by no means a surface without space before and behind it. For the analysis of such essences given in intuition, which is a literary task, all physiological or metaphysical hypotheses are worse than useless. They are sophistical and blinding and tend only to satisfy the honest face of experience. The question of whether I see distance is a question not for science but for me. If I see distance, I see it. If I infer it, as when I ask myself how far a distant object may be, I infer it. But the contention that when I see it, I must nevertheless be inferring it is impertinent. From what should I infer it when the result of the supposed inference is the only essence before me? Nothing is present to the spirit at any time but what is then present to it. This cannot be in the least altered by the fact that other things may have been present to it, or to other spirits at other times. These other moments will have, no doubt, an equal importance to themselves, and memory or theory, surveying them in their imagined order, may see a plot or development in them which may seem more interesting than any of them in isolation. But this history or plot exists for the spirit only in that contemplative or retrospective moment in which, as at the end of a Greek tragedy, it is summed up and proclaimed. Such a plot is a perspective in the imagination, a poetic or philosophic idea, itself a surface view of surfaces. The causes of all these incidents, of their existence as well as their sequence, lie far beneath. Ideas are not material things, or tribes of animals, though idealists might seem to think so, in tracing their genesis or evolution through the world. It is the movement of the world, of the conditions and causes of those ideas, that we are tracing under their name. And intuition is like a flame. If the substance that fed it can continue to feed it, or can kindle it again, it may endure or revive. In the midst of such other intuitions as the flux of life may involve. Discourse thus proceeds in a connected but spasmodic manner, expressing at each moment the cumulative energies, habits, and impulses of the psyche, herself a mode or cycle of physical events, but the phases of spirit, the actual intuitions and emotions which diversify experience, are as little capable of adding themselves up as the kisses of yesterday are of building nests in the air and hatching the kisses of tomorrow. Suppose finally a Chinaman at the Louvre invited to admire the Venus of Milo. The admiration expected of him is to be a spiritual emotion, an actual flight or transport into a fresh region of the beautiful. It will not do if intellectually he is able to recognize the master lines of the statue, although broken, or because broken, nor if he can recall the place which our historians of art may assign to such a theme in the development of sculpture. I will assume that he is a man of cultivated taste, accustomed to the arts of his own country, so full of delicate ministrations to the senses, and so flattering to the ironies, perhaps to the cruelties, of the mind. He will relegate to their place the keys to universal history offered by philosophers, and the technical devices that may seem for the moment the whole of art to the snobs of the studio. And after listening to both, he may continue to feel in his heart that this leaning block of marble is blank and heavy, that a Greek goddess is but a stalwart washerwoman, and that such monumental designs are thick, vacant, chalky, clumsy, and rude. He will remain cold because he will mishear the things which in his case can work the miracle and entrance the mind, things minute, ornate, suave, party-colored, fragrant, incidental. The sense of beauty is not a feeling separable from some intuition of form. On the other hand, it is a feeling, not a verbal or intellectual judgment. It arises by the convergence in the psyche of many assaults and many reactions, from far and near. Some of these influences may come from the region which the aesthetes of the last generation denounced as morality, or from that which the aesthetes of today denounce as literature. Some may come from erotic sensibility, from familiarity, from lucidity, from harmony with other esteemed things. The Venus of Milo will not seem beautiful in any deep sense to anyone incapable of feeling the luminous scorn, the victorious perfection of the Greek immortals. But all this composition, though we may give moral names to its elements, occurs underground. It is physical and merely preliminary to the beauty realized in intuition. This realized beauty is not compounded of those miscellaneous extinct impressions. It could certainly not be bred in a soil which these impressions had not raked and watered, but it is a fresh flower with its own form, its own scent, and its own naughtiness. For this reason, too, it cannot be preserved mummified in any external object. It can belong to things only by being attributed to them by some living soul. Those who insist that the marble Venus must be either beautiful or ugly in itself, apart from all Greeks and Chinamen, are allowing a grammatical form of judgment to mislead them about the subtler ways in which essences may be manifested in the world. Not the marble which a man without any sense of beauty might see is the seat of beauty. The contrary quality may be as truly attributed to it. The only Venus which is inalienably beautiful is the divine essence revealed to the lover as he gazes, perhaps never to be revealed to another man, nor revealed to himself again. And this manifest goddess, for so the gods were originally revealed, her beauty is indeed intrinsic and eternal, and it is as impossible that its particular quality should be elsewhere as that she should be without it. The nature of essence appears in nothing better than in the beautiful, when this is a positive presence to the spirit and not a vague title conventionally bestowed. In a form felt to be beautiful, an obvious complexity composes an obvious unity. A marked intensity and individuality are seen to belong to a reality utterly immaterial and incapable of existing otherwise than speciously. This divine beauty is evident, fugitive, impalpable, and homeless in the world of material fact. Yet it is unmistakably individual and sufficient unto itself, and although perhaps soon eclipsed, is never really extinguished, for it visits time, but belongs to eternity. The type of being which I call essence has long been familiar to philosophers, and it is unfamiliar to the man in the street, not because it is too remote from him, but because it is too near. I might almost say that my theory is a variant of Platonism, designed to render Platonic logic and morals consistent with the facts of nature. I am afraid, however, that this readjustment unhinges Platonism so completely that I have no right to call my doctrine Platonic. In the realm of essence, as I conceive it, the sphere of Socratic ideas is infinitely extended and freed from all confusion with natural forces. I am no pupil of Plato's in all that phase of his thought in which he seems to supply the lack of a cosmology by turning moral and ideal terms into supernatural powers. The supernatural is nothing but an extension of the natural into the unknown, and there is infinite room for it. But when these deeper or remoter parts of nature are described in myths evidently designed for the edification or easier government of human society, I distrust the fiction. I distrust it, as a piece of physics or information about matters of fact, but it may be a genuine and beautiful expression of the moral experience and the moral interests which have prompted it. In this capacity, even the myths and the cosmology of Plato are memorable. They become again pure essences for poetic contemplation, like the ideas, and their moral significance helps to render them warm and interesting to a man of feeling without deceiving him about the conditions of his natural life. In calling his ideas ideas and his myths myths, Plato seems to acknowledge that they are, after all, nothing but essences. The power which they were represented as exercising over nature was not their chief claim to respect. Nature was a phenomenon to be superseded. The material image once shattered, the God which it represented so imperfectly would appear in his proper glory. His power was an accidental effect due to the proximity of a matter capable of reflecting his likeness and of preserving it for a time. His intrinsic and eternal being was that of an essence. Such, I think, was the fundamental conviction of Plato in his free moments. At least such was afterwards the experience of many a Platonizing soul in ages more religious than that of Plato. Without any pretense to be religious or mystical, I find myself daily in that case. I cannot read a book or think of a friend or grieve or rejoice at any fresh event without some essence rising sensibly before me, the sole actual harvest to me of that labor. At every moment, the rattle of the machine of nature and of my own engine, unless I lose the sense of it altogether, is at once revealed and hidden by some immediate essence, which it wears like a shining garment, or more often, perhaps, merely suggests to me as its meaning, its beauty, or its secret. How should spirit ever come upon anything else? Yet, this trick of arresting the immediate is, in one sense, an interruption to life. It is proper only to poets, mystics, or Epicureans. It was incompatible with the political, censorious temper of a traditional Greek philosopher. Socrates and Plato, on the whole, were conservative. They were absolutely serious only in their patriotism, in their legislative convictions, in their zeal for a well-ordered life. The rest of their philosophy was designed to be a safeguard or an ornament for the perfect citizen. They were content that his mind should dwell in the castle of words in a mythical world, no matter how fantastic, if only his hand was strengthened thereby, and his will concentrated on maintaining intact the stone walls and the iron laws of his city. The same sentiment is perennial with conservatives, and would be reasonable if any city or any morality could really be conserved. But substance is in flux, in spite of the cries of all tragic heroes. Myths, maintained artificially, cannot restore morality, but a new harmony in life, divining a new morality, will clothe itself spontaneously in some new myth. Socrates and Plato could not revive the Greek city which they loved, but they facilitated the triumph of Christianity, which would have filled them with horror. The stone walls crumbled and the air castle remained. Essence thus came to its own again, but abusively, pretending to be more than essence, and mankind has been divided ever since between the impulse to admire the vision and the impulse to denounce the lie. If a philosophy like Platonism, founded on the intuition of essences, so soon materialize them into existences, spirits and powers, objects of belief not amenable to intuition, no wonder that other systems, initially interested only in alleged facts, physical, psychological, or theological, should have overlooked essences altogether. Not that the most distracted or dogmatic mind ever ceases, in fact, to contemplate mere essences, namely, the terms in which it frames its views and the emotions with which it views them. But the object it is intent upon is always an ulterior object, an existing world, where the things and events it believes in shall stand or move in a framework of external relations. When it calls these existences sensations, atoms, space, time, or persons, and wonders which of these names describes them best, the test does not lie in any comparison of essences evoked by those names and the essences of the existing objects. For since these objects are removed facts, their essences cannot be present to intuition. The consequence is that in thought the given essences lose their interest. You stop asking yourself what positive notion you have of a person or an atom, of space or of time, or of a sensation. The choice between these notions becomes like the choice of words in a sentence, not determined so much by their intrinsic character as by the relations into which they fall, and the current of intent and expectation that runs through some in one direction and through others in another. In other words, what concerns the naturalistic philosopher in his choice of terms is the external relations which, in using them, he is led to attribute to the pressing events which they designate. For his purposes, an atom is the unit, whatever it may be, in physical transformations. Sensation is a means, no matter what, of registering a fact. A person is a center, be it what it will, of observation or opinion. In this way, not only physics but psychology comes to disregard the actual terms in which it frames its system, and empiricism overlooks the only objects of immediate experience. Nevertheless, the bias of such an outlook exclusively towards existence is too violent not to have its nemesis. Essences neglected here will assert themselves there. They will invade and perhaps absorb the ultimate description of what is supposed to be an existing world. Those who reject essences as terms swallow them as myths. Descriptions of the universe, when clear, are so fantastic, so evidently mere essences evoked in human thought, that the very interest in existence which begat those descriptions presently disowns them, and everybody wonders how such studious and earnest men could be the dupes of their own fables. But in reality, those fables are not more fantastic than the daily aspect of the sunset or the grammar of common speech. They are essences appearing just as immediately to the mind, only more labored and articulate, and as symbols for the facts of nature they may be just as true. Indeed, their immediate charm sometimes overcomes philosophers at the end of their speculation, as it overcomes artists and poets at the beginning. They see that what delights them is not a fact, not even a truth, but an absolute essence. This ultimate recognition of essence is normal in mathematics, nor can it be easily avoided in metaphysics, especially when mathematics, logic, or poetry becomes dominant there and takes the bit in its teeth. When Descartes, for example, identified matter with extension, he substituted essence for substance, an improvement, no doubt, for mathematical purposes, but an abdication in genuine physics, which is founded on animal faith. Substance was what Descartes meant to describe. It moved, and extension, being an essence, cannot move. When he imagined geometrical figures, indistinguishable in scale, parts, or quality, and bounded by merely ideal lines, nevertheless moving in reference to one another, he was substituting a possible pattern of nature for living nature herself. The essence in his clear and distinct intuition seemed to him fundamental and final, and so it would be to pure spirit. He forgot that a spirit could not be born, die, or have a local habitation in the bosom of an essence. The only substance remaining in his system, the only being self-existent in all its parts and in actual flux, was accordingly the discourse in which the material world might appear as a picture. Descartes thus became the father of psychologism against his will, and the scientific reform which he meant to establish liberated mathematics and mechanics, but otherwise left confusion worse confounded. It was reserved for Spinoza, still under the persuasion that he was describing substance, to conceive the realm of essence in its omnimodal immensity. Human vanities, whether in speculation or in manners, were not for him. He had a just conception of man's place in nature and in the presence of the infinite. Love cast out both fear and greed from his mind. His approach to essence is the more interesting for not being guided by any Platonic motive, as he never cultivated poetry or sentimental theology. So he might have neglected essence altogether if he had taken it merely for what it was. All that his pious heart respected was substance, that which exerts force, works in nature, and might feed or threaten him in his contentment. In spite of his speculative scope, his wisdom was Levitical. He craved above all things to be safe and sure in his corner of the Lord's house. This safety had, as it were, two phases, or two dimensions. Materially, in the Lea of the Tempest, the swallow might build his temporary nest. Such happiness was a part of what universal nature provided, but ideally he might borrow the wings of the storm and enjoy perfect freedom and identity with that force which in creating and destroying all things is never exhausted or defeated. It was the plethora of this passion, at once sacrificial and omnivorous, that carried Spinoza into the realm of essence, made him gloat on its infinity. He found a cruel pleasure in asserting that every part of it existed, thereby putting to shame the conceit of mankind, and that abasement finding a fanatical compensation for his own frailty. Why indeed should not all essence exist? If extension be the essence of matter, every possible geometrical figure, and every possible superposition and substitution must be equally real at every point in nature, and yet all points pure extension, motionless and undivided, must be somehow the only reality. So in the other, the psychological world, if thinking be the substance of all thoughts, all possible thought should be equally present in every act of thinking, yet nothing in any thought should be real except the act of thinking in its purity. This tragic contradiction, tragic because so many instincts and passions meet and destroy themselves there, comes to hypostasizing essence and attempting to rationalize substance. The substance of this world, as it may have occasion to argue in its place, is no mere essence, such as extension, pure being, or pure consciousness, hypostasized in its bareness. It is an existential flux of unknown extent and complexity, which, when it falls into certain temporal systems which we call living bodies, kindles intuition there, and brings various essences to light, which become terms in belief and knowledge. But substance, although thus posited and symbolized by the animal mind, always remains obscure to it. How should the essences, mainly emotional and inwardly elicited, which events evoke in this or that sensitive organism, reveal substance in its inmost constitution and total extent? That substance at this point has produced those appearances is indeed one of its characteristics, and so much we may safely assert of it forthwith. But to legislate for substance in our own private parliament, or to assert that the whole realm of essence must somewhere be reduced to act, as Spinoza supposed, is perfectly gratuitous. Moreover, when the definition of the realm of essence, all distinct beings of all kinds, is turned into a definition of substance, it contradicts another definition, pure being, which Spinoza could not help regarding with equal rashness as the essence of substance in some deeper sense. Natural substance must be allowed to rejoice in whatever essence it has, and to change it as often as it will, and to bring to intuition in our scattered minds such visions as it likes. And meantime, in the realm of essence, pure being and all beings may lie eternally together like the lion and the lamb in the peace of non-existence. Very likely, in its chosen ways, the existing world may be infinite, but the inevitable absolute infinity of the realm of essence, a matter of definition, does not justify me in ascribing a fabulous infinity to substance. In Leibniz, who had a wonderfully clear head, the realm of essence appears in sharp distinction from existence, under the name of all possible worlds. But this notion is introduced almost playfully in the midst of a theological myth. We are invited to assist at the deliberations of the Creator when in his primeval solitude he debated which of the worlds that he could imagine might most congenially keep him company, for it was not good, he felt, for God to be alone. Now, if we take this fable literally, the Creator already existed and was himself one of the possible worlds, and a very special one, for he possessed an intuition of the whole realm of essence, and beneath that, a mysterious propulsive nature of his own which inclined him to create other living beings, and enabled him to distinguish a better and a worse among mere possibilities. Indeed, if we remember the religious sources of this conception, which Leibniz was obliged to treat with respect, we may safely say that this gallery of possibilities present to the Creator's mind is not the realm of essence at all, but an emanation of particular existing nature, just as it is not the realm of essence in its entirety that swims before a novelist when he debates what conclusion to give to his novel, but the alternatives that suggest themselves are only a few, such as lie within his experience and conspire with his purpose and are compatible with the plot of the novel as far as it is gone. This Creator would then be a perfectly contingent existence, a particular being finding himself already at work. He could not have asked himself before he existed whether he would be the best possible God. The fabled problem of creation must already have been solved before it could be proposed, and a mind considering which world to choose is a world existing without ever having been chosen. The notions of the possible and the best, otherwise unintelligible, become significant in reference to the accidental potencies and preferences of that existing being. His creations, like those of any living artist, would then be naturally in his own image, and it would turn out that of all those possible worlds, only the best was really possible, since a motive for creating one of the others would necessarily be wanting. The best would be simply the one which the Creator actually preferred and must have preferred, unless, what is inadmissible, he did not know his own mind. I need not enter into the moral difficulties which this rigid monotheism involves, Suffice it that the realm of essence has dropped out of sight, and our philosophy is reduced to an account, credible or incredible, of some natural events and some natural existences. But perhaps we should not press in this manner words which a philosopher could only have met figuratively. Leibniz makes some explicit reservations about time. The original solitude of God was ontological only, not historical, and time, being an integral part of creation, could not have preceded the creative act. In reality, then, this creative act would be the perpetual process of nature, viewed under the form of eternity and represented poetically as deliberate and voluntary. If we allowed ourselves to continue this method of rationalization, perhaps the realm of essence would come into its own again, and the mind of the Creator surveying all possible worlds would be only a dramatic metaphor for that immutable background which the realm of essence supplies for all the shifts of existence. Perhaps, too, the moral compulsion which, according to Leibniz, God was under, to distinguish and to create the best of possible worlds, might be interpreted as inverting mythically a homely truth, namely that the best and only possible world for a creature to live in is the world that produced him. We may grumble and we may suffer, but we should not have been ourselves in any other world or nation or family. The circle of our demands and ideals is but a floating expression of the faculties which reality has fostered in us. The actual world, in type if not in detail, is therefore always such as it would be if the good to which it aspires had created it. This is the reason why at bottom most people are so well satisfied with their country and with themselves, and why existence is normally regarded as a benefit. Leibniz could be a very great philosopher when he chose, when the press of business allowed, or when some serene highness commanded it. But he was a diplomatist even in philosophy, and his chief preoccupation was to reconcile powerful opinions and to recommend himself to the orthodox as well as to the competent. He could play as readily with the notion of essence as with any other notion, but his sincerity was not of that profound sort which gives to human conceptions their radical values, and his system was a masterpiece of artificiality in which nobody, not even himself, could very heartily believe. Essence was familiar to Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, because even if not scholastic themselves, they were trained in the scholastic tradition, which was itself but Platonism made prosaic and Christian. But the same cannot be said of the British and German philosophers. Yet both psychology and the criticism of knowledge ought to bring essence to light, since essences are the only objects of indubitable and immediate experience. A profound confusion, however, intervened. The objects of experience were confused with experience itself, which was assumed to be self-conscious, a series of states of mind which know what they are and are what they know. Essence, accordingly, became a needless, if not impossible, conception, because the only essences that could then be found or thought of would be essences existing and knowing themselves to exist. In other words, they would not be essences, but what is a contradiction in terms, facts given in intuition. The insecurity and anarchy prevailing in these schools allow them to traverse the ground in 1,000 directions without ever disengaging the radical possibilities and principles involved. For instance, they almost always combine their axiom that existence is self-conscious with a naturalistic view of the course of human experience, deployed in time and distributed among well-known persons and nations, a combination which would be impossible if either of the two views had been thoroughly analyzed. The notion that existence is self-conscious and conscious only of the state of mind which it is excludes the possibility of any transitive knowledge or even belief, because it reduces every object, whether of intuition or intent, the process of thinking it. The notion of a flux of experience or thought reporting one of its parts to another of its parts is accordingly excluded. And yet, without such naturalistic history and psychology, self-consciousness would lose all its interest, because it would be conscious of not being knowledge, but of being only the intuition of an essence devoid of meaning. Of late, however, various judicious persons trained in these schools have begun to confess that consciousness is not aware of itself, but of objects variously styled sense data, or concepts, or neutral entities, either mental, not material, or simply objects, meaning essences present to sense or thought as opposed to the events in nature which they symbolize. But it is events in natural knowledge that are the true objects, and the given essences are only the terms in which those events are described. If these terms are hypostaticized and set in a network of natural relations, as if they were things, the result will be a pictorial physics which may have its merits, but which is not the realm of essence. To reach the latter conception, it would be necessary to remember that what is given never has any relations but those which are given with it. It is therefore always an eternal essence and never a natural fact. Natural facts are objects of intent only, and then the propriety of the names, images, categories, or other essences which we use in conceiving them becomes problematical. On the other hand, essences problematical as descriptions of facts are manifest as ideas. The more hypotheses we try, and the more alternatives we consider, whether we attain absolute truth or a sufficient symbolic truth, or no truth at all, we are still entertained by ideas which are innocent if we do not abuse them, and perhaps beautiful and significant if they express our own playful or creative impulses. Not is this entertainment with essence a trivial bond with reality. Facts, however momentous, are transient and local, and truths, however eternal, are relative to these transient and local facts. But every essence, whether it ever have or not the adventitious dignity of a truth, is in its own right a something, a verse or a letter in that infinite Quran sealed from all eternity in the bosom of Allah, of which the trembling angel of life may read to us a few surahs. That it should be these and not those is the tragic mystery of our fate and of all existence. That others also should someday be manifested in other worlds or to other spirits would be a further decree of fate, but that all should lie for ever in the realm of essence is a luminous necessity raised far above any accident of destiny or decree of power. It cannot be otherwise. If you deny that realm, you acknowledge it. If you forget it, you consent that it should silently laugh at you in your sleep.